Fred, it's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing us to do this and tell us a little bit about your life story.
You'd ask an old person about their life, and they'll talk forever. And if you ask them about their health, they just keep going and on and on and on. So, ask a question and I'll answer it.
Let's start at the beginning. What led you to become a naval aviator?
I went to high school. We had my dad and I drove into the city from the county, and then I went to St. Louis U High, so I had to take the city bus up to the high school. And so in the ride into the city, I would always be reading one of my books, prepping for class. And my father said to me one day, he says, when you go to college, you're going to have to work. I misinterpreted him. I thought he meant I was going to have to work my way through college. So for my junior year in high school and thereafter, I was always looking for a way to get a scholarship. And I went to the Jesuits at the high school, and I asked, I'd like to apply for a scholarship to college, and they said, well, you're 33rd out of 200, and so we don't recommend that you apply for a scholarship because we don't want to have it turned down. So I'm concerned, and there's an announcement over the 1MC, that's the Navy term, over the public address system. It said, anybody interested in a Navy scholarship, come down to the Dean of Discipline's office. So after school, I went down to the Dean of Discipline office, and there's nobody there, but there's some little brochures there, and I picked a brochure, and I said, nobody else is down here. I'm going to go sailing right through this. 75 guys applied out of the 200 in our class. Remember, the draft was in full service then.
And what year would that have been?
That would have been in 54.
Okay.
And so we ended up out of 70. We took a test. We took the test at St. Louis University in DeBear Hall. And I walked out of there, and I didn't know where I left my car because it was just a nonstop for 4 hours, continuous. And I was notified that I should then proceed to the old post office and for a physical. And we went to the old post office, and 20 of us out of the 75 showed up at the old post office for physicals. And they said, take your clothes off. It's cold, and they got marble benches in there. And we all took our clothes off, and the doctor went down, and he checked all of us, and one guy fainted dead away. I mean, it was a strange situation. So out of the 20, there were eight left, and we had interviews. And then we had interviews, and after the interviews, I got the scholarship. And I was allowed to pick any one of 52 colleges: Harvard, Yale, Brown. But I elected to stay in the Catholic system, and I picked Notre Dame, Holy Cross, Marquette, and Villanova. Notre Dame sent me a letter back and said, well, we'll take you as a regular student, but our NROTC unit is filled. And I sent a letter to Holy Cross and said, I'd like to come, and they said, send me $10. So I sent them $10, and I never saw the campus. I got on. They put me on. Mom and Dad put me on a train here at the Union Station, and they dumped me at Worcester, Massachusetts. And I got out of the terminal with my suitcase, and walked out. And there was a taxi, and I said, "Can you take me to Holy Cross?" He said, "Yeah." whipped me up to Holy Cross, and I went in and I said, I'm here to go to school. And they said, you got to go get sworn in first. So I went and got sworn in, and the guy in front of me and I struck up a conversation. And I ended up being his godfather for his third child.
Wow.
And he joined the Navy. Obviously, he joined the Navy. We both elected to fly. We went to flight training together. He didn't drive, or he didn't have a car. And so after we got commissioned, we went to the head of the destroyers and cruisers in the Atlantic to check in. It was our first duty station, and they said, "Oh, we've assigned you guys to a frigate, or a destroyer leader." It's sort of like a frigate, and you have to go join it. And we thought it was there in Newport, but it wasn't. It was back in Boston. So we had to go back to Boston, and it was in the shipyard, and it didn't have any water under it. And
it was still in dry dock.
It was in dry dock, and he and I stayed there for 3 months, and then we went to flight training. And
so tell us about that a little bit. What did you train on? What did you end up flying? What kind of aircraft did you prefer?
We started out in a little single-engine prop T-34 Mentor, they called it. It was 225 horsepower, and it bounced everywhere. And in Florida, the panhandle of Florida, it was hot. It just bounced everywhere. And I got airsick every time I got in there with an instructor. It was just terrible. But my instructor was supposed to fire me if I got airsick 2 times in a row, but he didn't. And after the 4th time, I went to the sick bay and I got some Dramamine, and we were out flying, and he said, "What's the matter with you?" And I said, "Well, nothing's the matter with you." He says, "Yeah, you're flying terrible." He says, "What did you do?" "Something's the matter." I said, "Well, I took Dramamine." He says, "I'll tell you when I want you to take Dramamine. Now, knock it off, and when you come back tomorrow, I don't want any Dramamine in your system." I said, "Okay." So I continued to get airsick every time, and at the 13th hop in this little airplane, we took off, and we were flying around, and sure enough, I got airsick, and I got my bag, and put some stuff in the bag, put it under my leg, and he says, "Go land in that field over there." And I said, "Okay." So I went and landed in a grass field. He says, "Taxi over by that tree." So I taxied over by that tree, and I looked back, and he's getting out of the airplane. I said, "What's going on?" He says, "Come back in a half hour and pick me up." So I took off, and I didn't get airsick flying by myself. So after that, I'd do an acrobatic flight. He would show me what he wanted me to learn. Then he would say, "Okay, you got it. Go out the next day and practice it. And then you come back and show me, and then I'll show you the new acrobatics." Well, when I went out by myself, I did straight and level, and I didn't move. I didn't rock my wings. I just stayed as cool as I could. And then when it came time for me to fly with him, I, of course, get sick again and do the acrobatics, and he showed me the new ones, and we did that. And then at the finals, the last flight before I left that airplane, I had a different instructor. And he said, he took me out, and one of the things that they do is they have you bend down and put your head between your knees, and then they put it in a unusual attitude, and then they say, "Okay, you got it," and you're to recover from whatever attitude you're in.
Right.
And I recovered, and then I said, "Excuse me," and I grabbed my bag. And he says, "What did you just do?" And I said, "Well, I got airsick." He says, "Okay, we're going home." I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, if you get airsick on a check ride, you're washed out." I says, "I fly all the time airsick." He says, "Well, you're never going to pass." He says, "But I'll tell you what." He says, "I'll continue the flight, and if you're not going to be doing very well." Well, I ended up doing just well enough to get out. It took 2.85 to get out, and I had a 2.86.
Wow.
Never got airsick again. Moved on to a bigger airplane, bigger engine, more powerful, faster, flew higher. That went from primary to basic. And then we went to advanced, and in advanced, this was 1959. I got down to advanced, and of course, there's not much going on, but it's the Cold War, and the anti-submarine looked like a promising field. So I had first pick, and I picked, out of 32 guys, I picked anti-submarine warfare aircraft. Twin-engine props, crew of 4, pilot, co-pilot, and 2 electronics guys in the back. And I completed that and then flew that for 3 years. Went to...
So these were combat flights? No?
We were looking for submarines.
Okay.
Didn't find any. We on one of the cruises we had the ship had a mixed bag of anti-submarine warfare and anti-submarine helicopters, and on one cruise in '62 we had a load of marine helicopters similar to the anti-submarine helicopters, and bunch of civilians came aboard the ship, and we painted out U.S. Marines on the side of the airplanes and made them plain. And the next thing you know, all these Marine pilots are in their civvies and hopping in those airplanes and going ashore, and that was Air America. It was at 62. Fast forward... 1975, I was the air officer on an aircraft carrier, and I recovered Air America. Only now they were firing Bell Jet Rangers, beautiful airplanes.
Yes.
Silver and blue. Woo. Nice. Anyway.
So you saw combat.
Well, from the ASW, I went to graduate school for in Monterey for electrical engineering, and then I taught at the Naval Academy for 2 years, and I was at the Naval Academy from 65 to 67, and in 66 they washed all the jet pilots out of D.C. and sent them back to the fleet. And at the time, we used to have to fly 100 hours a year to maintain our proficiency, and so we would fly 8 hours a month in the type of aircraft that we were familiar with. I'd been flying props back to the same airplane that I'd been flying in basic. And so I looked at all the airplanes down there at Andrews Air Force Base, and there are a lot of jets just sitting there. So I called down and I said, I'd like to put my name on the list of guys to convert to jets. And they said, we don't have such a list. And I said, let me just give you my name anyway in case you do get a list. And so a week later I called and I said, hey, how's my name going on that list? He says, we don't have a list, sir. I said, well, okay. So I called another week later, and a guy said, I says, how's my name doing on that list? And he says, we're only taking people who have another year at least in Washington. And I said, I have another year in Washington. He says, well, I'll get back to you. He called me the next day, and he says, can you be down here Monday to start flying these jets? And I said, sure.
What kind of jet?
It's a T-1. There's swept-wing airplanes,
Right.
and there's straight-wing airplanes. And straight-wing airplanes fly slower to land than swept-wing airplanes because they have more lift. And these were straight-wing airplanes. They were T-1s, are called a T-2V, Shooting Star, Lockheed aircraft. And so I went down and I started flying those, and I got about 100 hours in those. And then I called my time was up at the Naval Academy, and I called my detailer and I said, I want to fly jets and I want a combat squadron, but I want it out of Jacksonville, Florida. I want a vanilla and strawberry and put cherries on top of it and nuts. I'm really. So the guy comes back and I said, well, I want to fly the A7, which was a brand new airplane. And he says, oh, no, we're not taking guys that have no jet experience to fly A7s. I said, oh. I said, well, then I'll take A6s. They're twin-engine jets, bombers. And he said, no, you have to have previous attack experience to fly those. And I said, oh, well, okay. Well, I'll take an A4 then. He says, okay, we'll give you an A4. So my friend that I'd stood behind when I first joined the Navy was working in the Pentagon, and he called me and he says, I don't think you're doing something very smart. And I says, well, we're at war. I want to be there. He says, well, do me a favor. He says, we have a program set up called the Jet Transition Training Unit down in Texas. And
right.
You go down and you learn how to fly a jet. Because I had not told anybody that I knew how to fly jets. So they sent me down there, and I flew the F9 Cougar, F9 Cougar, which is a Korean War airplane, but they had single seat and double seat Cougars. So I went down there and flew that, and got to Jacksonville. I was assigned to a squadron that was going to Vietnam, except by the time I got through with Jet Transition Training Unit and then I learned to fly the A4, squadron that was going to Vietnam just got back.
Oh.
And they were assigned to the Forrestal. Now, the Forrestal had just been in a fire, the big bad fire out, and killed 137 sailors, and ship was 2 years in overhaul. And since it had spent all that time not going to Vietnam, they decided that they were going to make it go on an 11-month cruise to make up for the pressure that it put on the other carriers.
Right.
So we did. We had an 11-month cruise to the Mediterranean. I mean, it was like cruising the Med on your uncle's yacht. I mean, it was really, really nice. We had almost every port that was any significance in the Mediterranean. And so when we got back after 11 months of cruise of flying A4s off this great big airplane, a big aircraft carrier, I called the detailer and I said, you owe me a squadron that's going to Vietnam. He says, oh, okay. Because guys were doing everything they could not to go.
And you were asking to go.
I was asking to go, yeah. And so they moved me right from that squadron because they were becoming flying A7s. They were going to transition to A7s, And they figured, okay, you had 2 cruises because it was 11 months. It was like equivalent of 2 cruises. You're finished. And so, but they gave me another cruise. And I went out on the Shangri-La. And we left Jacksonville, and we went around the bottom of Africa through the Straits of Malacca on up by Singapore and then on to the Philippines and then into the South China Sea.
Right.
We had it was a 7-month cruise, and it was proposed that we come back via New Zealand, Australia, and around the bottom of South Africa, South America. So out, down, around the world cruise. And while we were over there, we didn't fly into North Vietnam at all because they had declared a bombing halt in order to get the peace process going. That was in 1970. And they weren't successful getting the peace process going, but we had a bombing halt, but we didn't bomb into Vietnam, North Vietnam, but we did South Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Laos. And we did that for, well, it was supposed to be for about 5 months. And at the end of about 3 months, I'm coming back aboard ship one night, and I'm flying the most beautiful pass you'd ever seen, and I'm all set, and the landing signal officer waves me off. And I broke radio discipline. I said, "What the hell was that for?" He says, "You won't believe this, but we just lost a screw. I had four screws on the ship. One of them came off. It's 4 stories high, a screw. And it came off and went into the bottom of the ocean. So we only got 3 screws, and that's not enough to make the ship go fast enough to get the wind over the deck to recover airplanes."
Huh.
So they sent me to, well,
You had to land somewhere else.
of course.
Right.
That was obvious, right? Even you know that.
Yeah.
But I called the ship and I said, "What am I supposed to do?" And they said, "Wait out." And so I said, "Well, it's obvious that I'm not going to land on that ship." So I climbed as high as I could. You have to get rid of as much fuel as you can, because there's a maximum amount that the airplane can weigh when it engages the wires. And one of the things that you do is you get rid of any excess fuel you have before you land. And I had done that because I was on final. And so I'm basically low fuel. And so I climbed and I climbed and I climbed, and I got to 30,000 feet, and I said, and I'm headed for Da Nang in South Vietnam. And the ship still hasn't given me any information. And finally, I'm 60 miles from the ship. It's going to be touch and go whether or not I have enough fuel to make it to Da Nang at the time. It was Air Force Base in South Vietnam. And about that time, the ship says, your signal is bingo, go to Da Nang. Of course, I was already 60 miles.
Boy, there.
And so
Yes.
I'm calculating whether or not I'm going to make it, And about that time, somebody from the ship calls up and says, "Does anybody want gas?" And it was a guy who had been launched from the ship with a full load of fuel and in-flight fueling package. And so I called him and I said, "Has anybody checked you out? Do you work?" And he says, "Yeah, it works." And I said, "Okay, where are you?" And it turns out he was about 20 miles behind me. at 20,000 feet. And so I turned around and zipped down and found him, got fuel from him, pulled out, checked to make sure all his stuff was clean, looked down, and my engine is running pegged. It's overtemping. So I pulled the power back and kept going towards Da Nang, and I got it down into the range where the engine was not overtemping, and ended up declaring a minor emergency for Da Nang. And just as I'm getting ready to come in, they said, well, we'd like you to go high over Monkey Mountain, which is off the end of the runway, an island, because it's active, which meant they were shooting off of it. So I went high off of it, went down, landed at Da Nang, rolled out the end of the runway. I turned off the end of the runway, added power, and the engine started coming apart.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah.
That close?
Yeah, that close. And so I had to shut it down. And they came out and they towed me into a revetment. I called the ship and I said, when it cooled, the engine cooled down, I got a flashlight and I looked up the tailpipe and I could see where some of the blades had come down the tailpipe. So I called the ship and I said, we need an engine.
Yeah.
And they said, we'll send the chief. I said, yeah, but I'm going to need an engine. They said, we'll send the chief. I said, oh, okay. So the chief came in the next day and took him out to the airplane. He looked up the airplane and he says, you need an engine. I said, thank you, Chief.
I told you that already.
Yeah. Well, I had been the maintenance officer in that squadron, so I pretty much knew what was going on.
So what so this is early 70s. So when was the evacuation then? Did you help
75.
with that? You helped out with that.
I was the air officer.
Okay.
On the Hancock, but I still had another cruise to do.
Okay.
So the Air Wing commander decided that I would be perfect for his operations officer, but he was going back and getting a new bunch of airplanes. We were flying A4s and F8s. He was going to get A7s and F4s and come back, and he wanted me to be his number 2 guy, so he sent me back early. So I missed New Zealand, I missed Australia, didn't have to cruise back, and I started flying A7s. He got back, and they changed his orders, and they gave somebody else the rest of the Air Wing, and the new guy said, I don't want you. So I ended up staying, teaching other people how to fly the A7, and then I got selected for promotion, a squadron, and then they called me and said, we got a 1A4 squadron that's going to have to make another cruise to Vietnam on the Hancock. Would you be willing to take command of it? And I said, yeah. I said, I'll take it if it were in hell. And so I went out there and joined them out there for the end of that cruise and came back. We went after that cruise. We went to North Vietnam. We bombed in North Vietnam.
Okay.
So I got about 60 missions in North Vietnam on that cruise. Came back.
What are your memories of that?
Well, not. I remember the bad ones. My squadron did not lose anybody on that cruise. During the course of the Vietnam War, the squadron that I was in lost 16 pilots. And of the 16, we got one back, who was a POW. He went in as an ensign and he came back as a lieutenant commander. But we didn't have any losses. We had the hits in the squadron airplanes, but we were able to patch them and fly them anyway, I didn't get hit. I watched a guy get smoked from the other squadron. We had 2 other squadrons on the ship of attack aircraft, and we had 2 of fighter aircraft.
Right.
And so we were out one day, and one guy called and said, "Hey, I got a truck here on the coast highway." He said, "We're going to go in and destroy the truck." So all of us said, "Oh, that sounds like fun." So we all went roaring over to the coast, and as we got there, he was making his second run at the truck. And he says, "They're shooting," and I watched, and sure enough, they were shooting, and they hit him. And so he turned and headed to this ocean, and he ended up just in flames. We kept telling him, "You get out," and he says, "I'm getting further out than I need to get further out." So he hung on to get about 3 miles out, and then he jumped out, punched out,
Right.
ejected, and then we set up a rescue operation. My wingman and I, we had our bombs, and we were detached to escort the helicopter in, and to fake out the batteries, the shore batteries, to thinking that it was us and shoot at us instead of the helicopters. And they pulled him out, and we went back and escorted him back out. And then those guys that made the mistake of shooting at us, we decided we'd drop our bombs on them because that wasn't fair. We were trying to rescue a guy. A couple other incidents that are at the front of my mind, but a lot of them just fade because you're just so interested in flying formation and making sure your bombs are on the target that you're oblivious to most everything that are going on.
So back at home, we watched the evacuation then eventually, and you were in charge of that?
The evacuation of Vietnam is...
I mean, I think of Saigon, right? And the
yeah,
last flights out.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Well,
Right.
The evacuation was a long-term process, but the press only covered the bottom end of it, the last of it, and they had been moving people out for a long time.
Right.
They moved out a 747 full of children who were of American and Vietnamese ancestry. The kids were in orphanages and stuff like that, and they moved them out. And one of the last 747s that went out had them in it. At the same time, they're shipping people out, and they're flying people out, and then because we knew it was going to go downhill, and we had a task force, and we had our ship had gotten rid of all of our jets, and all we had on our carrier was Marine helicopters, the great big ones, CH-53s, the CH-46s. The 53s would take 60 people. 46s would take 20 some odd. And then they had UEs, which would only take 6 or so, and then the Cobras, which are gunships. And I had turned over my squadron, and they sent me to the ship to be the air officer. So I was supposed to be the assistant air officer, and it was supposed to be a year in training as the assistant and then take over as the air officer. And got a new commanding officer. He didn't like the cut of the air officer's jib, and he fired him after 5 days and said, "You're it." And he says, "You get anybody on the ship you want can be your assistant."
That's some on-the-job training, huh?
Oh. So I got a guy from my squadron come up to sit with me while the bureau sorted it out, and we were doing jets, and then we sailed, and I had a guy who was to do my assistant for a year,
right?
But the ship was going to be decommissioned after a year, so he was anyway. When we got to Hawaii, they said, here are all these Marine helicopters. Take them over to Vietnam. So we took them over to Vietnam, and on the way, they said, get rid of your fixed-wing airplanes. We're sending you more helicopters. And so they sent us more helicopters, and we got rid of the fixed wings en route and absorbed the new helicopters as we got into the Philippines. And so when we pulled into the Philippines in port, we offloaded all the air wing personnel, pulled all the Marine personnel on, offloaded all the air wing spare parts, and we went back to sea. And we did the evacuation of Cambodia, and then we waited for about 3 weeks, and then they said we'd do the evacuation of Vietnam. And the evacuation of Vietnam, our role was just to provide the helicopters, and we were not to take any refugees. We were only going to pull out 792 refugees. These were people that had been earmarked as in danger of losing their life if the North Vietnamese took over. And we started the evolution, and it was supposed to take 8 hours. And the ambassador kept coming up with more people that he wanted to get out, And we're 24 hours into the operation, and the ships that were supposed to take these people are jam-packed, and so they started taking them on our ship. And where we were supposed to have none, we had 2,000. When we were the whole operation was only supposed to have 792, and we took out 8,000. Ours was an interesting evolution. We had.
So were you there at the end?
Oh yeah,
right there. So the pictures we see in our mind of the helicopters taking off from the embassy, were you in charge of those?
No,
Okay.
Well, I may have been, but I was only responsible for them at 3,000 feet above the ship, 5-mile radius. Okay. Anything that moved in that envelope, I was responsible for, and I controlled. And I was up for 24 hours, and I ended up being up for 33 hours before we finally wrapped it up. And just as we're getting ready to wrap it up, we get these. Have you heard of the Right Stuff, and Chuck Yeager?
Yes.
And
yes.
A lot of pilots imitate his "How y'all doing?" that type of thing. And so I'm sitting out on the ship, and it's. The guy calls and he says, Rampage Tower, this is Air America 4, inbound to you with 5 minutes of fuel. You got a spot for me? That type of thing. So I said, yeah, we got a spot for you. Ended up recovering 12 Air America airplanes.
Wow.
But we'd already recovered all of our helicopters, and maybe 16 or 17 South Vietnamese helicopters. You know, they
So it was a full deck, huh?
we pushed them over the side. Remember those pictures of them pushing over the side? You can't believe how eager those sailors were when I said, push that airplane over the side. Man, they were running up and just we had
because the point was not to recover the equipment, but the people.
The people, exactly.
Right.
The first aircraft that we got was a Chinook, and the Chinook blades don't come off. That's the one with the boom in the bottom and the two things, and the blades here and the blades there, and back and forth. Had really a wonderful airplane. But the guy brought it out, and I didn't have any place to put it. I couldn't put it in the hangar bay because it's got all those blades on it. There was no place to put it, and so I put it on the end of the stern of the ship. And I called the captain. And I says, "That's gonna make a mess. It's gonna be a hazard. We're gonna need that space." He says, "What do you want to do?" And I says, "I want to push it over the side." He says, "Do it." So I got the sailors and we pushed it over the side. This beautiful, heavy lift airplane.
Bottom of the ocean.
Bottom of the ocean.
Well, decisions you had to make.
And then one of the airplanes that we had was outfitted with a Huey that was outfitted with a sound system in there and padding on the inside and mohair seats, you know, just like the old cars, you know. It was beautiful inside. So I'm walking down there on the hangar deck, on the flight deck, looking at all these airplanes, helicopters that we now have on our flight deck, and I just said, "Oh man, that's a nice one." So I got back up in the tower and I called the captain and I says, "Well, I've got my airplane." And he says, "What do you mean?" I says, "Spoils of war. I recovered this nice airplane." And he says, "You just wait a minute." And the next thing you know, he's down on the hangar deck with his two Marine orderlies, because we now have a 2,000 people that aren't ours on that ship, and we did something. And anyway, he went and looked at the airplane and came back, and he says, "I hope you're not picking the one with the mohair and the sound system, because that's mine." I said, "Okay."
You got trumped on that one.
So he one of the things that he did was he had a meeting before we started the operation, and the operations officer came out and he says, "Well, we're going to 782. We won't have any people." And we had all of the commanders sitting around the table, and they went around and they said, "If we had to, how many people could we take?" And the executive officer of the ship pulled out his little book and he says, "We have 182 empty bunks." And it came around to me and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "We could probably take 2,000. He said, "What do you mean 2,000? I said, "Well, put them on the deck, under the airplanes, sleep under the airplanes." And he said, "Well, we don't have any." And the supply officer says, "Well, we could put them on bubble wrap." And so he said, "I'm going to get bubble wrap." So we were prepared to take 2,000 people, whereas other people were not. And then the captain says, he says, "I don't want anybody on the ship who hasn't been inspected." He says, "I don't want any guns." "Well, what do we do with the guns, sir?" He says, "I want you to throw them over the side."
Yeah. Did you find a lot?
Oh, yeah. We had the doctors and the dentists inspect the women because we had women. We had a little old lady get off this helicopter and come to the island structure before. That's how you get down into the ship. And she had her granddaughter, and she had a shopping bag, and the Marines had her open her shopping bag, and they pulled it out, and they checked everything in the shopping bag, and she had an ugly statue of Buddha. Oh, man, he was the ugliest thing I ever saw. The Marine pulled out his K-bar, and he sliced it. It was solid gold.
Wow.
And she's jabbering it up.
Mad.
Oh, man, and he took it and he handed it back to her. Well, we ended up putting them down in the hangar bay, and we're now maybe 48 hours from the start to this place, and everybody's sort of settling down. And we had captain decided to go down and see the people in the hangar bay. When we got down there, it was a mess. I mean, they're all sitting on bubble wrap. I mean, they're all got their own little kingdoms, with stuff on the edges of the thing, and they've carved out their portion on the ship. And he calls me and he says, "Get that cleaned up." He says, "I don't want filth in my ship." I said, "Yes, sir." So I sent my people down there, and I said, we had an elevator in the center of the ship. The new ones don't have that, but the old ones did. And this was an old ship. It was a Hancock, World War II.
Right.
And so we moved them onto the elevator. We're going to take them up. We're going to take them topside and let them walk and get some fresh air. That's the story. So we put them on the elevator, and we took all the people in the Bay 1, put them on the elevator, took them up. And they were walking around the flight deck, with Marines all around. But they're walking and getting some exercise and everything. And we came back down, and the people from Bay 2 looked and said, "Oh, that's a good spot over there in Bay 1." And they moved over, and oh my gosh, we almost had a riot.
I'll bet.
Because these people had stolen their spot. So,
what a life.
We had fish heads and rice. We didn't have fish heads, but we had fish, and we had a lot of rice on board because we assumed that was part of their diets. We cordoned off a couple of the restrooms and for women, and we were Viking ship. We didn't have men. We only had men on, no women. And all of a sudden, the women went into the restroom, and all of a sudden you hear the laughing and screaming, and kids yelling and having all kinds. And the Marines were outside because they can't go anywhere. Only one entrance to the restroom, but they're not going in the restroom. And finally, they called the Marine captain, and they says, "Sir, something's going on in the restroom. We don't know what's going on." He says, "Go in and find out what's going on." So they walked in, and these women had the kids in the commodes,
bathing them.
Yeah, but it's stainless steel. The commodes are stainless steel, and they're flushed with salt water. We don't use fresh water, but they're in there bathing in the salt water in the commodes, and they're having a great time.
Wow.
So,
did you retire from the military?
Yeah,
you did. How many years?
22.
That's awesome. What was your rank?
Commander.
Congratulations on a great career.
Yeah.
And so let's talk after the military. When did Mary Jane come into the picture?
Oh, Mary Jane was in the picture let's see. She started in the picture in 59, okay. December 23rd, 1959. I was home from flight training, and my brother asked what I wanted for Christmas, and I said, "I want a blonde driving a sports car." And he says, "Okay." And so he fixed me up with this blonde whose father had a Austin Healey. And so we went to the movies, and after that she says, Can I write to you after the Christmas break?" And I said, "Sure." So she wrote damn near every day while I was going through flight training, and then when I got out of flight training, I came back to St. Louis. We had a couple more dates. I went out to San Diego. My parents brought her out for a 3 or 4 day weekend in San Diego, and we continued our correspondence. And I talked to her about. She was 4 years younger than I was, and she was 20 at the time. And she said, "I said, well, we might get married." And she said, "Well, we'll talk about it after your second cruise." This was my first cruise. I said, "Wait, ain't no talking about it in a second cruise. I'm making a second cruise." "Well, we'll talk about it." I says, "Nothing to talk about." goodbye. And so we split. And in 1964, I'm at Monterey, and I made a call to my folks at home, and I got a bad connection. And I called the operator, and I said, that was a terrible connection that I had on this call to St. Louis. And she says, well, would you like me to call somebody else in St. Louis for you, and there'd be no charge? And I said, and I hadn't heard from her in 3 years. And so I said, yeah, call so-and-so. So I called her, and she said, when's your next break? I said, I have a break of 3 days from in graduate school. We did a short semester. We did an intensive semester. We had a short break, like 3 days, and then we started a new semester. I said, I have a 3-day break, but I can't go anywhere because it's only 3 days. She says, I'll be there. So she came out in March of 74. We got married in June of 74. We had our son in October of in March of 65, 64, 65.
Okay. All right.
And then when we were in Annapolis and I told her I was going to Jets, she says, I wonder when you're going to graduate. So I said, oh, okay. Went on the med cruise and had her come over, and she was over there for a month following the ship. Her sister took care of our son, and she went home, and then she sent me a letter for Christmas with a Christmas card and says, you got a Christmas present, and it'll be probably around September.
Oh,
and then I had a daughter.
That's Karen?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's Karen. And we finished the Air Officer tour, and by now I'm really burned out. I mean, my fun meter was pegged, as my son said. I had enough fun. And they slated me for an air wing command, and I said, oh my gosh. I mean, I've been doing a lot of sea duty, and I said, I don't know. I don't think so. About that time, my brother-in-law, Virginia's brother-in-law, got cancer. And so I called Washington and I said, I want to go to St. Louis. I said, they got 6 kids, and he's got cancer. They're going to need help. So we came back, and we tried to help out as much as we could. And I got to St. Louis in July of 76, and his cancer's in remission, and I'm really bumming. I mean, I turned down an air wing to come to St. Louis. CO recruiting. I had a recruiting command. And he died in December. So the oldest child was 16, and the youngest one was 7 or 8. And we had moved close to them when we came to St. Louis. They lived in De Pere. We moved into Kirkwood. And so we were able to assist in whatever needed to be done.
So when did you leave the military?
80.
1980.
Yeah.
Okay.
They couldn't get anybody to come to St. Louis because it was tough recruiting at that time, and nobody wanted to do it. So I said, I'll stay as long as you know, but I don't have anything else to do. So I didn't have anything else in mind. So anyway, my son went to Chaminade. My daughter went to visitation. My son went to the Naval Academy on his own. I had all of a sudden I get a thing in the envelope from the Naval Academy, and we have the same name. And I said, "Why is the Naval Academy writing me?" Because I taught there for 2 years, so
Sure.
I said maybe they want to put me a big honor or something. Anyway, he had on his own applied to the Naval Academy, and Symington nominated him for the Merchant Marine Academy, and Symington's office called me and said, "Will he accept?" And I said, "Give me an hour." So I got him out of class, and he said, "No, I want to go to the Naval Academy." And I said, "Okay." And so I called Symington and said, "No." And I called he had a guy, as part of the process to go to the Naval Academy, you get interviewed by an officer. And I called the officer that interviewed him, and I said, he's just been selected for the Merchant Marine Academy. What do you think? And he says, "What does he want to do?" And I said, "He wants to go to the Naval Academy." He says, "Well, I'm not supposed to tell you this." He says, "But I have one appointment to the Naval Academy prep school. He has to join the Navy and go to the prep school. And if he satisfactorily completes the prep school, they send him to the Naval Academy." He says, "But I'm not supposed to tell you that." I said, "Okay." So I called him and I said, if you don't get the Naval Academy the first time around, what's your intentions?" He says, I'll go to St. Lucie and apply next year. I says, "Okay." So anyway, he went to prep school. He had 300 students there. He was number 10, so it was no problem. He got to the Naval Academy, and he coasted through the Naval Academy. There's not many people that coast through the Naval Academy. He didn't get any demerits, kept his head down, kept his mouth shut, did enough to pass until at the end of 7th semester, they go down and they pick their ships. He went down to pick his ship, and he was so far down the ladder in class standing that he couldn't get anything with guns on it. He wanted to go to San Diego. He wanted a ship with guns out of San Diego because his eyes were bad. He couldn't fly.
Okay.
So he got picked for the USS Cape Cod, which was a destroyer tender, and all they did was sit in the stream in San Diego and make parts for the destroyers. He was really bumming. Oh. So then he went to Surface Warfare Officer School down there where they learned to drive ships and stuff, and he tried very hard and was like number 1 or number 2 in the class. Oh, I didn't tell you, the last semester of the Naval Academy, he went from 2.0 average to a 3-point-something average. I mean, he finally got the message. So he ended up he got ships, and he liked them.
Must have been a proud moment for you. That must have been a proud moment for you.
Oh yeah. I had taken him out twice on aircraft carriers, fly him to Hawaii, and we rode the ship back. Once when I was Squadron CO, and once when I was air officer. And so he just ran around the ships like he knew what the hell was going on, and he really enjoyed it. So when he got on his first ship, he calls me. He says, "You want to go on a ship?" And I said, "Sure." So I flew out to Hawaii, and I rode a cruiser back.
Wow.
And they have what they call a pre-arrival meeting of the ship, and the senior watch officer, John, my son, is the junior lieutenant junior grade, and the senior watch officer says, "Well, so-and-so is going to drive the ship in," and the commanding officer says, "No, he's not. I want my best ship handler to do it." And he pointed to John.
Oh, nice.
So I stood up on on the flying bridge and watch John drive the cruiser into San Diego and park it. And he did a wonderful job. And then after that, he went to another ship, a patrol craft, took part in the invasion of Haiti. The patrol craft was a high-speed, small boat, 4 officers, 20 sailors, but they did insertion of SEALs. And so he did that, and then he went to a frigate, and then he went as chief engineer, and then he went to a destroyer as chief engineer, and then he went to the Armed Forces, the Army War College. Then he went to the Naval Academy as an instructor, and then he went to a landing ship as a damage control officer, and then he came to Scott.
Oh, ended up back home.
And he ended up at Scott, and he retired out of Scott, and then he got a job as a civilian in the same area that he was working as a naval officer.
Karen didn't go the military route?
No. Karen is a... she... how do I phrase this? She asked... When she was graduating from visitation, they said, well, we're going to give you, what kind of class ring do you want? She says, I don't want one. And they said, well, everybody gets a class ring. She says, I don't want one. They says, everybody gets a class ring. And she came home and told me that. And I says, just get a class ring. She says, I don't want a class ring. Only ring I want is a wedding ring. And I said, get a class ring. So she went back and she made him get him one in silver. Everybody else had gold. She got hers in silver. She went to Marquette University, called me, and she says, do you know I can get 18 hours for the same price as 12? And I said, yes. And she had just taken 15. And she says, well, if I take a class this summer at St. Louis U, that would make me have 18, and then I could get two degrees in 1 year, a double major. And I said, yeah. She said, will you fund one in the summer? I said, yeah. And then she called next year, and she says, will you fund karate classes? I said, yes. And, well, I did. Somebody jumped out and tried to accost her in Marquette, and she punched him in the neck. And then she had to leave the karate classes because she broke her hand on her instructor. So
wow.
Anyway, she's got her own business, has been for 28 years. She's a financial planner.
Oh.
She started her own firm after 7 or 8 years of working for somebody else. John's son did a summer at the Naval Academy to try it out. And says, yeah, they don't have any time to themselves. I don't want to do that. I'm going to go NROTC like grandfather did, which was what I did. And he did. And he picked University of Tampa, and he graduated in May from University of Tampa, and he's in Pensacola right now waiting for a class for flight training.
To be a pilot.
Yeah.
The grandpa. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What I know you filled this out on the questionnaire here, but what are your most cherished family memories?
We do things together. We do all the holidays together that we can, with the exception that my children's spouses get their family so that instead of, every Christmas is not everybody from our family because they got other, and now the grandchildren have significant others that they try to fit in too. So that's a pleasant thing. And about 10 years ago, we back up. My parents didn't take vacations until 1946, and we took 2 road trips, one to Colorado and one to Seattle, Washington, and then we took a trip to Minnesota. My dad liked to fish. We took a trip to Minnesota, and we stayed at an all-inclusive resort up there, and it was just wonderful. And my dad caught a lot of fish, and he was ecstatic. And so Mary Jane and I do a lot of traveling around the country, and we stopped in one time tried to find that resort, and we did. We found it, and Mary Jane says it's a slum because they had old buildings that were made out of sticks on the side. And so one day I was looking through the internet, and I looked up this resort, and it was back in business, and they had new buildings. And they just finished a new building that slept 17. And so I called my son and then called my daughter, and I said, I propose that we do this. And they said, we're in. So we all went up to Brainerd, Minnesota, and we stayed at this Pinecone Lodge in this 17-room house, and each family was required to cook a meal in the house for everybody else. And then each grandchild was allowed to bring a friend. And we had, it was just wonderful. And so at the end of the vacation, this new building, the owner said, if you want to come back next year, you have to reserve it. And so I said, well, I'll get back to you. So I proposed that to my son and my daughter, and I said, you don't have to tell me right now, but tomorrow would be a good time to tell me so I can tell them, and I can put the deposit down.
Yeah.
And so the next day, I asked them, and they said, well, I said, it's okay. We had a great time. We'll call it a day. It's a once in a lifetime. Well, a lady called me 5 years later and said, it's available again if you're interested. And I said, they already said that they weren't interested. I'm not going to say anything. Then I thought, no, I'm making a decision for them, and they're capable of making a decision. So I called them. Yes. So we did it again. And it was as delightful as it was the first time. And so now they wanted to recapture it, but I said it's just impossible to recapture. We have the grandson in flight training. I have a daughter. His sister lives in Bentonville, Arkansas, and she's got a job. I got a granddaughter that's a critical care nurse, ICU nurse. Although she's in Mexico right now. And then I got my other grandson. And I said, I don't think we can get all of them and their significant others. And it just doesn't work. And they wanted to do it for our 60th wedding anniversary. And I said, it just doesn't fit anymore. And besides that, it's not going to be like it was before. So I said, we just live with those memories.
You got such great memories of it.
Oh
and
yeah,
your
yeah.
family, and what a great legacy. You've seen so much in your life. You've done so much. How's the world changed since 1936?
Well, I don't remember much from 36. I do remember May 1940. That's when my brother was born, and I remember them bringing him home from the hospital. And I remember my father getting involved following the World War II. And I was required to be very quiet while the radio was on, where we were listening to what was happening in the war. And he prepared for the war. And my mother was I won't say she was a basket case, but she was affected because, her spouse going to the war was going to be something. He ended up not going to the war because his company was making things for the war, and they were being very successful at it, and he was approached about joining the Corps of Engineering and becoming a captain and coordinating everybody else's efforts. That was when everybody was behind the country. Everybody, I mean, I can remember lugging, shortening to the butcher shop because the glycerin, for nitroglycerin. I can remember saving papers. I can remember taking the lids off of the cans so you could flatten them and save that steel and send it back and get it reused. I subsequently found out that although we were rationed, the people in Hawaii were not. And you would have thought that they would have been, but no, they weren't. They knew about the war, the people in Hawaii. We weren't, so, when you really think about it, we haven't had a war in this country since 1865. And so you can't relate. So we've become very complacent. We don't have a national purpose anymore, I don't think. We have a lot of things that a lot of people want, but they're not all on the same page. Will they ever get on the same page? If we have a national, putting a man on the moon was something that wasn't possible until we did it. And that was a national purpose for a while. And then now it's my purpose and your purpose and no national purpose. So, it's tough. It's tough to look at it. And I correspond with almost on a daily basis with all of the guys that I was with in combat. We're starting to lose them. We didn't lose any of them in Vietnam, but now we're losing them to old age.
Well, Fred, it's been an honor talking to you and relating some of these memories. It's just, you've led an amazing life.
Yeah, it's been pretty full. But I associate with a lot of people that also had that same full life. And so we don't recognize it as being unique, or because we all did it. I introduced my grandson to my CO, the guy that I relieved as commanding officer of the squadron. Stayed for 38 years. He was a 4-star admiral. And I see him every time I go to Florida. And my grandson was down in University of Tampa, and I said, I sent him $125, and I says, I want you to drive over to Orlando and call Admiral Arthur. Admiral Arthur is his name, and I says, and take him out to dinner, take him out to lunch. Because I owe him a lunch, and I don't think I'm going to get down there. That was my excuse. And he did. He took him out, and they became really good friends. And what goes around, the Admiral's son is a captain, a four-stripe captain, and happens to be in charge of the Naval Aviation Schools Command in Pensacola. So my grandson can't get away with anything because this guy's, Anyway, that's pretty much how the Navy functioned over those years. And now I'm just hoping that there's enough of that left so that he can enjoy it. I mean, we did a lot of things to benefit the Navy and the country, and we did it on each other's word. No lying, no cheating, no stealing, not allowed. If I vouched for somebody, then that was my reputation was on him, and I put a lot of guys in a lot of good spots. And I guess they did put me in a lot of good spots, too. You sort of looked out after each other. It was not cutthroat. It can't be cutthroat in aviation. You got to look out for your wingman, your co-pilot. The sailors have to look out for you. You have to look out for them. So
those are the lessons you brought home to your family, right? And taught your family.
Yeah, but I already knew that. My dad took care of that. I mean, he was. Let's see. His foreman was in his company from 1946 until 1986. The guy that did the cutting, my dad had a steel company, and the guy that did the cutting with the torch died in the job after 40 some odd years. One of the young guys that worked there got cancer and kept coming back as he came back, and they kept the job open for him as he came back from cancer treatment, and he died. But it was when that load of steel went out, it went out with a coat of red lead on it, and maybe that red lead got to somebody. I don't know.
Right.
But anyway.
Fred, it's an honor talking to you. Thank you for sharing your story.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. Your family's going to appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope so.